The summer of 1978 settled over the small town of Bath, Ohio, with an uneasy calm that no one could quite explain. Streets were lined with modest suburban homes, their lawns trimmed carefully, their curtains drawn open to let in the long stretches of sunlight that defined Midwestern evenings. Families gathered for barbecues, teenagers cruised through town in old cars, and life moved forward with the comforting predictability that rural America had always promised. Yet, inside one particular house on West Bath Road, silence carried a heavier meaning. 17-year-old Jeffrey Dahmer had just graduated from high school, but unlike his classmates who celebrated with plans for college, jobs, or road trips, he found himself standing at the edge of a future that looked unusually empty. His parents' marriage had collapsed under years of arguments and emotional distance. His father had moved out, determined to escape the chaos, while his mother left soon after, taking his younger brother with her. The house that once held tension and noise now echoed with a haunting stillness. Jeffrey was left alone, wandering through rooms filled with abandoned belongings and unresolved emotions that he had never learned how to process. Neighbors barely noticed anything unusual. From the outside, he appeared like a quiet teenager enjoying newfound independence. He spent his days drifting between television, alcohol, and long stretches of isolation that slowly began to distort his sense of reality. His fascination with death, which had quietly developed during childhood through an unusual interest in animal remains and biological structures, started to evolve into darker and more troubling thoughts. These thoughts were not sudden bursts of violence, but slow, creeping ideas that intertwined loneliness with an unhealthy desire for control and companionship. Jeffrey's mind began constructing fantasies that blended emotional desperation with disturbing curiosity. He craved connection, but feared rejection, creating a psychological trap that pulled him deeper into isolation. Alcohol became his constant companion, dulling his anxiety while quietly amplifying impulses that he struggled to understand. The empty house became more than just a shelter. It transformed into a private world where boundaries between imagination and reality blurred with each passing day. As summer days stretched into humid nights, Jeffrey developed a routine that felt both aimless and ritualistic. He drove along quiet roads with no destination, scanning the highways and wooded routes that surrounded his neighborhood. Each drive carried an unspoken tension, as though he was searching for something he could neither define nor escape. His thoughts became heavier, more intrusive, and increasingly dangerous, though no one around him had the slightest idea of the storm building beneath his calm exterior. One evening in June, as the sun began to sink below the tree line and shadows stretched across the highway, Jeffrey climbed into his car and started another solitary drive. The air felt thick with summer heat, cicadas humming in the distance as he cruised along a road that would soon become infamous in criminal history. That drive would not end the way countless others had. On that quiet stretch of road, Jeffrey would encounter a stranger whose presence would ignite a chain of events that would alter not only his life, but also the way America would later confront the darkness hiding within ordinary communities. Before we continue deeper into this chilling story, if you are drawn to dark historical storytelling and psychological crime narratives, make sure to subscribe to Canon of Darkness and become part of this journey into the shadows of human history. We will uncover the moment Jeffrey spotted a hitchhiker standing alone on the roadside and why that single decision would mark the beginning of a nightmare no one saw coming. The evening air carried the slow warmth of early summer as Jeffrey continued driving along the winding roads outside Bath, Ohio. The golden sunlight had begun to fade into a softer orange glow that stretched across the tree-lined highway, creating long shadows that danced across the pavement as his car moved forward.
His driving had no destination, no specific purpose, and no urgency, yet his mind felt unusually restless. The isolation of the past few weeks had intensified his emotional instability, creating a sense of detachment from the world around him that made every passing mile feel strangely surreal.
As Jeffrey approached a quieter stretch of the road, his attention shifted toward a lone figure standing near the roadside. The young man was hitchhiking, casually dressed and carrying the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the world was generally safe and welcoming. His name was Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old traveler heading toward a nearby concert. He had been enjoying a day filled with music and youthful freedom, unaware that the ride he was about to accept would lead him toward a tragic and irreversible fate. Jeffrey slowed his car, studying the stranger with a mixture of curiosity and emotional desperation that had been building silently for months. His loneliness had created an intense craving for companionship, yet his inability to form genuine connections had twisted his desires into something dangerously unhealthy. Offering the young hitchhiker a ride felt, in that moment, like an opportunity to experience a fleeting sense of connection that he had long been denied. Stephen accepted the offer without hesitation, stepping into the passenger seat with the casual trust that defined an era when strangers often relied on one another during travel. Their initial conversation appeared ordinary and almost comfortable. They spoke about music, concerts, and youthful interests, creating the illusion of two young men sharing a spontaneous moment of friendship. Jeffrey felt a temporary emotional relief as the silence inside his house and his mind was replaced with laughter and conversation. However, beneath that surface interaction, his internal thoughts were beginning to spiral into darker territory. He feared that once the ride ended, the companionship would disappear just as quickly as it had appeared, leaving him trapped once again in overwhelming solitude. Instead of driving Stephen directly toward his destination, Jeffrey suggested stopping by his house to have a few drinks and continue talking. The proposal seemed harmless, and Stephen, enjoying the unexpected friendship, agreed without suspicion. As they entered the empty house, the environment felt unusually still, as though the building itself carried the weight of unresolved tension. They drank together, listening to music while the summer evening slowly faded into night, and for a brief moment, Jeffrey experienced the illusion of normal human connection that he had longed for throughout his adolescence. Yet, as the night progressed, Jeffrey's fear of abandonment began transforming into a dangerous emotional trigger. The thought of Stephen leaving created a wave of panic that clashed violently with his distorted fantasies about maintaining control over companionship. His internal conflict intensified as Stephen eventually mentioned that he needed to leave and continue his journey. That single statement ignited a psychological collapse that would push Jeffrey toward an irreversible decision, one that would forever change the trajectory of his life and mark the beginning of a chilling chapter in American criminal history. The tension inside that quiet suburban house was rising toward a breaking point. We will step into the exact moment when Jeffrey's fear of being alone collided with his darkest impulses, leading to a decision that would transform an ordinary summer night into the beginning of a horrifying legacy, making this story descend into psychological darkness that few people can fully comprehend. The atmosphere inside the quiet suburban house had shifted in a way that neither young man fully recognized at first. Music played softly in the background, blending with the muffled hum of summer insects outside the open windows. The dim lighting created long shadows across the living room, giving the space an unsettling stillness that felt heavier as the night stretched forward.
Jeffrey sat across from Stephen, trying to maintain the casual rhythm of their earlier conversation, yet his thoughts had begun racing uncontrollably beneath his calm exterior. Stephen remained relaxed, enjoying the drinks and friendly company, completely unaware of the emotional storm building within Jeffrey's mind. The conversation gradually slowed as the night deepened, and Stephen eventually mentioned that he needed to leave soon in order to meet friends and continue his journey. For Stephen, it was a simple and reasonable decision, but for Jeffrey, those words carried an overwhelming emotional weight that triggered an intense fear of abandonment. The fragile sense of companionship he had experienced that evening felt as though it was slipping away, threatening to return him to the crushing loneliness that had consumed him for months.
Jeffrey attempted to persuade Stephen to stay longer, offering more drinks and suggesting they continue listening to music. Stephen politely declined, explaining that he could not afford to stay any later. The polite refusal, though completely ordinary, ignited a psychological panic that Jeffrey had never fully confronted before. His internal fantasies about controlling relationships and preventing people from leaving began clashing violently with reality. The fear that he would once again be alone created a surge of desperation that slowly overpowered rational thinking. As Stephen prepared to leave, Jeffrey felt his anxiety escalate into something far more dangerous. His thoughts blurred together, mixing emotional instability with disturbing impulses that had quietly developed over years of isolation and alcohol dependency. When Stephen stood up to gather his belongings, Jeffrey's mind reached a breaking point. The fear of losing companionship transformed into an uncontrollable need to prevent Stephen from walking out the door. In that moment, Jeffrey grabbed a nearby object and struck Stephen from behind, collapsing the fragile illusion of friendship into a sudden act of irreversible violence. The room fell into complete stillness as the weight of what had just happened settled heavily into Jeffrey's mind. The music that had once filled the room with a relaxed atmosphere now felt disturbingly out of place, echoing through a space that had suddenly transformed into a scene of irreversible tragedy. Jeffrey remained motionless for several moments, staring at the horrifying reality before him while his thoughts spiraled between disbelief and overwhelming fear. The emotional desperation that had driven his violent action was quickly replaced by a crushing wave of panic that threatened to consume him entirely. As the shock slowly faded, Jeffrey's mind began racing through the terrifying consequences of his actions. He realized that the world outside his house continued moving forward as if nothing had changed, while inside, his life had taken a catastrophic turn that could never be undone. The fear of discovery began dominating his thoughts, forcing him to confront a problem he had never imagined facing. He felt trapped between guilt, confusion, and an overwhelming instinct to hide the truth at any cost, even though he had no clear plan for how to accomplish such a task. Jeffrey attempted to regain control of the situation by cleaning the living room, hoping to erase any visible signs of violence. Each movement felt mechanical and detached, as though he was operating on instinct rather than rational decision-making. His emotional state remained dangerously unstable, shifting between moments of regret and chilling detachment that allowed him to continue addressing the horrifying reality in front of him. The once familiar house now felt foreign and oppressive, its quiet corners filled with an unbearable tension that made every sound seem amplified. Hours passed as Jeffrey struggled to determine what to do next. The realization that he could not simply pretend the event had never happened forced him to consider actions that would permanently alter his psychological state.
His thoughts became increasingly focused on concealment, driven by a desperate attempt to protect himself from legal consequences and public exposure. The fear of being caught, combined with his distorted emotional reasoning, created a dangerous mindset that allowed him to justify decisions that would push him further into darkness. As night slowly gave way to early morning, Jeffrey began taking steps that he believed would eliminate evidence of the crime. Each decision carried a disturbing level of calculated focus, revealing a chilling transformation in his behavior. The panic that initially overwhelmed him gradually shifted into a cold determination to erase the truth, even though he struggled internally with the reality of what he was doing. His actions were not driven by confidence or planning, but by a desperate attempt to escape a situation that he had created through emotional instability and uncontrollable impulses.
The rising sunlight outside his windows symbolized the beginning of a new day for the rest of the world. Yet for Jeffrey, it marked the start of a psychological descent that would reshape his identity and future actions in ways he could not yet fully understand. The fear of exposure continued haunting his every movement, forcing him to confront decisions that would further disconnect him from reality and morality. What began as panic was slowly evolving into a disturbing acceptance of choices that would define the darkest chapter of his life. We will uncover how Jeffrey attempted to dispose of evidence and the disturbing psychological changes that occurred during this process, revealing how his desperate efforts to hide the truth gradually strengthened the dangerous mindset that would influence his future crimes, creating a chilling transformation that would push him deeper into a world of secrecy and emotional detachment. Morning light slowly filtered through the curtains, casting pale streaks across the rooms of the house that had once felt ordinary but now carried the suffocating weight of a hidden crime. Jeffrey moved through the space with a sense of nervous urgency, fully aware that every passing hour increased the risk of discovery. His thoughts were tangled in fear and desperation, yet an unsettling determination began shaping his behavior as he focused on eliminating every trace of the previous night. The reality of his situation had forced him into a psychological state where survival overshadowed morality, creating a chilling shift in how he processed his actions. The quiet suburban neighborhood outside remained peaceful, with distant sounds of morning traffic and neighbors beginning their daily routines. That normalcy contrasted sharply with the disturbing secrecy unfolding inside Jeffrey's home. He understood that any mistake could expose him, and this fear pushed him toward decisions that required emotional detachment. Each movement felt calculated, yet deeply unstable, as though he was attempting to distance himself from the full emotional consequences of what he had done. His mind drifted between moments of anxiety and eerie focus, revealing how quickly panic had begun transforming into a darker form of rationalization.
Jeffrey's primary goal became the removal of evidence that could connect him to the crime. He approached this task with a disturbing mixture of hesitation and mechanical precision, struggling internally while forcing himself to continue. The process demanded actions that would permanently alter his psychological boundaries, pushing him further away from empathy and deeper into a mindset driven by secrecy and control. His attempts to eliminate physical evidence required hours of effort, each step increasing the emotional and psychological distance between the person he once was and the individual he was becoming. As the day progressed, Jeffrey realized that hiding the truth required more than simply cleaning or removing visible signs. He needed a method that would prevent any connection between himself and the crime from being discovered in the future.
This realization introduced a terrifying level of calculation into his thinking. The emotional panic that initially dominated his behavior slowly began merging with a colder, more disturbing logic. He convinced himself that if he could completely erase the evidence, he could bury the memory and continue living as though the night had never happened. The effort to carry out these plans left Jeffrey physically exhausted but psychologically transformed. The overwhelming fear that had consumed him earlier began giving way to a numb acceptance of his actions. That numbness allowed him to continue making decisions that pushed him further into darkness, reinforcing a dangerous belief that he could control the consequences of his behavior if he remained careful enough. The isolation of the empty house amplified this transformation, removing any external influence that might have forced him to confront the moral gravity of what he was doing. By the time evening approached, Jeffrey believed he had successfully concealed the crime, yet the psychological damage had already taken root within him. The terrifying realization that he had crossed an irreversible boundary lingered beneath his fragile sense of relief. He could not fully understand how profoundly this experience had altered his perception of control, power, and emotional connection, but the change was undeniable and deeply unsettling.
Instead, it awakened disturbing fantasies and emotional patterns that would begin influencing his thoughts in ways far more dangerous than his initial panic, setting the stage for a psychological evolution that would gradually lead him toward an even darker and more calculated path. The days following the crime unfolded with an unsettling sense of forced normalcy as Jeffrey attempted to resume his routine while carrying a secret that had fundamentally altered his identity. The quiet suburban surroundings of Bath, Ohio continued operating with the same predictable rhythm, with neighbors tending to their homes and families enjoying the comfort of summer evenings. Yet inside Jeffrey's mind, a profound transformation had begun taking shape, one that he neither fully understood nor possessed the emotional strength to resist. At first, Jeffrey believed that successfully hiding the crime would allow him to regain control over his life. He convinced himself that if he avoided drawing attention and maintained a calm exterior, the horrifying event would fade into a distant memory. However, instead of disappearing, the experience lingered in his thoughts with increasing intensity. The emotional panic that had driven his initial actions slowly evolved into a disturbing curiosity about the psychological power he had felt during the crime. This realization created an internal conflict that deepened his emotional instability, blending guilt with an unsettling sense of fascination that he struggled to acknowledge. Jeffrey's isolation continued amplifying his intrusive thoughts. With his parents gone and no close friendships to ground him in reality, he found himself trapped within a private world shaped by distorted fantasies and unresolved emotional trauma. Alcohol remained his primary escape, dulling the anxiety that surged whenever memories of that night resurfaced. Yet alcohol also lowered his mental defenses, allowing darker thoughts to resurface with greater clarity. These thoughts were not impulsive flashes, but prolonged fantasies centered around control, companionship, and the desperate fear of abandonment that had triggered the crime in the first place. He began replaying the events of that night repeatedly in his mind, analyzing every detail with a chilling sense of reflection. Instead of viewing the experience purely as a horrifying mistake, his mind began twisting the memory into a distorted lesson about maintaining control over relationships. The realization that he had prevented someone from leaving created a dangerous psychological reinforcement, planting the seeds of a pattern that would later define his criminal behavior. This shift marked the beginning of a deeper emotional detachment as empathy and remorse struggled to compete with his growing obsession with preventing loneliness at any cost.
Jeffrey's outward behavior remained deceptively ordinary as he prepared for the next stage of his life. He planned to leave for college and attempt to rebuild a sense of normalcy, hoping that a change in environment might silence the disturbing thoughts that had begun dominating his mind. However, beneath this attempt at reinvention, his psychological state continued deteriorating.
The unresolved trauma of his childhood, combined with the emotional consequences of his first crime, created a volatile internal landscape that made genuine recovery increasingly unlikely. As summer faded and Jeffrey prepared to leave Bath, he carried with him not only the secret of his crime, but also the dangerous psychological transformation that had begun reshaping his identity. The decision to move forward without confronting his actions allowed those distorted thoughts to grow stronger, quietly preparing him for future behavior that would become more calculated and terrifying. Lies in the chilling reality that Jeffrey's attempt to escape his past by leaving home would not free him from his darkness. Instead, his transition into adulthood would expose him to new environments, deeper emotional instability, and opportunities that would slowly reignite the dangerous impulses he believed he had buried, pushing him toward a path that would eventually escalate into a pattern of calculated and horrifying crimes. As the final days of summer slowly disappeared, Jeffrey prepared to leave the quiet isolation of his childhood home and step into a new chapter of adulthood. From the outside, his departure appeared like a typical transition experienced by many young Americans who left small towns in search of education and independence. His father hoped that college would provide structure, discipline, and a sense of direction that Jeffrey had struggled to find during his teenage years. Friends and relatives believed that distance from his past might allow him to rebuild his life, unaware that he was carrying psychological wounds far deeper than anyone could imagine. Jeffrey enrolled at Ohio State University, entering an environment filled with energy, ambition, and social interaction. The campus represented opportunity and personal growth for most students, but for Jeffrey, it quickly became another stage for emotional isolation. Surrounded by thousands of young adults forming friendships and planning their futures, he found himself unable to connect with the social rhythm of college life. His inability to develop genuine relationships reinforced the same loneliness that had consumed him in Bath, except now it existed within a crowded environment that made his emotional detachment feel even more intense. His drinking habit, which had already begun shaping his behavior during high school, escalated dramatically during his time at college. Alcohol became his primary method of coping with anxiety and suppressing the disturbing thoughts that continued surfacing in his mind. Instead of addressing his psychological struggles, Jeffrey used intoxication as a shield against reality, gradually losing control over his academic performance and personal responsibilities.
Professors noticed his lack of attendance, and his grades began declining rapidly, reflecting the internal collapse that he was desperately attempting to hide. Jeffrey's mental state became increasingly fragile as memories of his first crime continued haunting him. The experience did not fade as he had hoped. Instead, it resurfaced in distorted fantasies that blended emotional desperation with disturbing curiosity. He struggled to understand why these thoughts persisted, often convincing himself that they were temporary psychological reactions rather than warning signs of a deeper and more dangerous transformation. The absence of emotional support or professional intervention allowed these intrusive thoughts to strengthen, quietly shaping his perception of control, companionship, and power. His father, recognizing Jeffrey's academic failure and worsening alcohol dependency, eventually intervened and encouraged him to leave college. The decision was presented as an opportunity to reset his life through discipline and responsibility, leading Jeffrey toward enlistment in the military. The structure of military life appeared promising, offering strict routines and external authority that many believed could stabilize his behavior. Jeffrey entered the armed forces with the possibility of reclaiming control over his future, but beneath his disciplined exterior, the unresolved psychological damage continued influencing his thoughts and emotional responses. While military service initially provided a temporary sense of order, Jeffrey's internal struggles did not disappear. The rigid environment suppressed his impulses rather than addressing them, creating a fragile balance that relied heavily on external discipline rather than genuine emotional healing. As he adapted to military life, the darkness within him remained quietly present, waiting for moments of vulnerability that would allow it to resurface. Lies in the disturbing truth that the discipline of military life could not permanently suppress Jeffrey's psychological instability. As personal struggles, substance abuse, and emotional detachment began interfering with his service, his eventual discharge from the military would remove the structure that had been containing his impulses, setting the stage for his return to civilian life, where his darkness would begin evolving into something far more calculated and terrifying.
Jeffrey entered military service carrying expectations placed upon him by family and society, both hoping that strict structure and authority would reshape his unstable behavior. The early days of training introduced him to a world built upon routine, obedience, and physical endurance. Every aspect of military life demanded precision, discipline, and mental focus, creating an environment designed to break down individual weakness and rebuild soldiers into dependable units. For many recruits, this transformation created confidence and purpose. For Jeffrey, it provided temporary distraction from the darkness that continued lingering beneath his controlled exterior. At first, the demanding schedule reduced his isolation by surrounding him with fellow soldiers and constant responsibilities. He followed orders, completed training exercises, and attempted to adapt to the regimented lifestyle. Observers might have believed he was gradually stabilizing, yet this appearance masked deeper psychological struggles that never truly disappeared. The emotional wounds from his past and the unresolved trauma connected to his first prime remained buried within his thoughts, quietly influencing his perception of relationships and control. Jeffrey's reliance on alcohol, which had already shaped his behavior before entering the military, soon resurfaced as a destructive coping mechanism. The stress of military duties, combined with his inability to process emotional tension, pushed him toward excessive drinking whenever opportunities arose. Alcohol temporarily numbed his intrusive thoughts, allowing him to escape disturbing fantasies that had begun reappearing with alarming intensity. However, intoxication also weakened his discipline, leading to behavioral issues that drew attention from his superiors and fellow soldiers. As months passed, Jeffrey's performance began deteriorating due to his increasing dependency on alcohol. His inability to maintain the strict standards required by military service created growing frustration among commanding officers.
His emotional instability and substance abuse problems gradually overshadowed any progress he had made during training. Despite the rigid structure designed to maintain control, Jeffrey's internal conflict continued intensifying, revealing that external discipline could not replace the psychological healing he desperately needed but never sought. Eventually, his behavior forced military authorities to make a decision that would dramatically alter his future. Jeffrey received an early discharge, marking the collapse of yet another opportunity for stability. Leaving the military removed the final structured environment that had been containing his impulses, returning him to civilian life without guidance or emotional support.
This transition created a dangerous freedom that allowed his unresolved psychological issues to surface with greater force, free from the oversight and restrictions that had previously limited his actions. Upon returning home, Jeffrey faced a familiar yet unsettling reality. He remained disconnected from meaningful relationships, burdened by memories and fantasies that continued evolving into darker and more calculated thoughts. His sense of identity had fractured further, leaving him vulnerable to impulses that he struggled to control. Without the routine of military life, his days became unstructured, increasing his isolation and strengthening the psychological patterns that had begun during his teenage years. Lies in the chilling realization that Jeffrey's return to civilian life would introduce him to environments where his impulses could grow without restriction. As he drifted between temporary jobs, unstable living conditions, and escalating substance abuse, the darkness inside him would begin reshaping his behavior into something far more deliberate and organized, setting the foundation for the terrifying escalation that would eventually transform him into one of the most infamous criminals in American history. Returning to civilian life placed Jeffrey in a position where he was expected to rebuild stability, yet the absence of structure quickly exposed the fragile state of his mental health. After leaving military service, he struggled to find direction while drifting between temporary living arrangements and short-term employment opportunities that failed to provide meaningful purpose. His father attempted to support him by encouraging responsible behavior and helping him secure basic work, hoping that steady routines might prevent further decline. However, Jeffrey's internal struggles continued intensifying beneath his outward attempts to appear functional.
Jeffrey relocated to West Allis, Wisconsin, where he lived with his grandmother, who offered him a calm and supportive environment. Her home provided safety, stability, and emotional care that Jeffrey had rarely experienced in his life. She encouraged him to attend church, maintain steady employment, and avoid the drinking habits that had already damaged his future. For a brief period, Jeffrey appeared to respond positively, securing work at a local chocolate factory and maintaining a routine that created the illusion of progress. Observers might have believed he was finally recovering from years of instability. Despite these external improvements, Jeffrey's psychological condition remained deeply fractured. The memories and fantasies connected to his first crime had not disappeared, but had instead evolved into more persistent and disturbing thoughts. He found himself increasingly preoccupied with controlling companionship and preventing abandonment, emotional obsessions that had begun shaping his worldview in dangerous ways. His grandmother's house, although safe and welcoming, could not shield him from the intrusive thoughts that continued resurfacing with growing intensity. Jeffrey's alcohol dependency gradually returned, quietly undoing the fragile progress he had made. Drinking provided temporary relief from anxiety and disturbing fantasies, but it also weakened his emotional restraint. As his drinking increased, his behavior became unpredictable, and his nights often involved wandering through bars and public spaces searching for social interaction that he struggled to form naturally. These outings were not driven by typical social curiosity, but by a deeper psychological craving for control and companionship that he had never learned to achieve in healthy ways. During this period, Jeffrey experienced several encounters that revealed the dangerous direction his thoughts were taking. His attempts to form relationships became increasingly influenced by his obsession with dominance and permanence. These internal conflicts created moments of disturbing tension as he wrestled between the desire to appear normal and the darker fantasies that had begun shaping his identity.
Each failed attempt at connection reinforced his loneliness while strengthening the psychological patterns that had emerged years earlier. Eventually, Jeffrey's behavior began creating concern within his grandmother's home. His drinking habits, unusual late-night activities, and emotional instability strained the supportive environment she had worked so hard to maintain. Although she cared deeply for him, she could not fully understand the depth of his psychological struggles or the dangerous fantasies that were slowly gaining control over his thoughts. The stability he had been offered began slipping away as his internal darkness continued growing unchecked. Lies in the terrifying realization that Jeffrey's increasing independence and worsening psychological state would soon push him beyond the protective boundaries of his grandmother's home. As he moved toward living alone, he would gain the privacy and freedom that allowed his disturbing fantasies to transform into calculated actions, setting the stage for the chilling escalation that would eventually lead him back toward violence in ways far more deliberate and horrifying than before. As Jeffrey's behavior grew increasingly unstable, the fragile balance that had allowed him to live under his grandmother's care began collapsing. His drinking habits intensified, and his late-night activities created tension within the household that his grandmother could no longer ignore. She had hoped that offering him a safe and loving environment would help him rebuild his life, yet she gradually realized that something far deeper was troubling him. Her concern eventually led to difficult conversations about responsibility, independence, and the need for Jeffrey to establish his own living arrangements. Although her decision came from a place of care, it unknowingly removed one of the final barriers that had limited Jeffrey's most dangerous impulses. Jeffrey moved into his own apartment in Milwaukee, a decision that marked a critical turning point in his life. The apartment offered him complete privacy, allowing him to live without supervision or emotional accountability. For most individuals, independent living symbolizes adulthood and personal growth, but for Jeffrey, it created an isolated environment where his psychological struggles could evolve without interruption. The quiet walls of his apartment provided him with a sense of control that he had never fully experienced, reinforcing his growing obsession with maintaining dominance over his surroundings and relationships. He continued working at the chocolate factory, maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy that concealed his worsening mental state. His daily routine appeared stable, yet his nights told a very different story. Jeffrey increasingly spent evenings visiting local bars, searching for companionship in ways that reflected his deep emotional void. These interactions were not driven by genuine social interest, but by a desperate attempt to fill the loneliness that had defined much of his life. His inability to form lasting emotional connections continued strengthening his distorted belief that companionship could only exist through control. Inside his apartment, Jeffrey's fantasies became more vivid and structured. The privacy he now possessed allowed him to explore thoughts that he had previously suppressed due to fear of discovery. These fantasies blended emotional desperation with disturbing curiosity, creating a psychological environment that encouraged dangerous ideation. The isolation removed social accountability, allowing him to justify thoughts that would have otherwise been challenged by external relationships or authority figures. His mind began constructing scenarios that reflected his obsessive fear of abandonment, reinforcing the belief that he needed absolute control to prevent people from leaving his life. Jeffrey's substance abuse also escalated, further weakening his emotional restraint and intensifying intrusive thoughts. Alcohol remained his primary method of escape, but it simultaneously amplified his darkest impulses. The combination of isolation, addiction, and unresolved psychological trauma created a volatile mental state that moved him closer to repeating the violence he had committed years earlier. His apartment became more than a residence. It transformed into a private psychological chamber where fantasies and reality began merging in deeply disturbing ways. As months passed, Jeffrey's emotional detachment grew stronger, and his thoughts shifted toward testing the boundaries of his dangerous desires. He began seeking opportunities to bring strangers into his private space, believing that he could maintain control without facing consequences. This shift represented a chilling escalation from fantasy toward calculated action, revealing how his independence had accelerated his psychological deterioration. Lies in the horrifying truth that Jeffrey would soon act on these growing impulses, leading him toward encounters that would mark the beginning of a terrifying new pattern of violence, one that would transform his apartment into the center of a dark chapter that would shock the nation and permanently alter the history of American criminal investigation. Jeffrey's apartment in Milwaukee gradually became more than a place of residence. It evolved into a carefully controlled environment where his psychological fantasies could unfold without interference. The privacy he had gained allowed him to construct routines that revolved around his growing obsession with companionship and control. While his daytime life maintained a surface appearance of stability through employment and predictable routines, his nights increasingly reflected a disturbing shift toward deliberate behavior. His visits to bars and nightlife venues were no longer casual social outings, but calculated searches for individuals who could temporarily satisfy his emotional cravings. Jeffrey developed a pattern of observing potential companions, carefully selecting individuals who appeared approachable and unlikely to attract immediate attention if they disappeared from his life. His outward personality often appeared quiet, polite, and unthreatening, creating a deceptive sense of safety for those who interacted with him.
This ability to mask his internal instability allowed him to build brief connections with strangers who believed they were meeting someone seeking friendship or casual company. However, beneath this calm exterior, his thoughts were shaped by fantasies centered on maintaining permanent control over companionship, a dangerous psychological evolution that had been growing since his teenage years. As Jeffrey began inviting individuals back to his apartment, he carefully crafted interactions designed to create comfort and trust. Music, conversation, and alcohol were often used to build a relaxed environment that disguised his underlying intentions. These encounters represented a terrifying escalation from intrusive thoughts to calculated behavior, revealing how his isolation had strengthened his belief that he could manipulate relationships without facing consequences. Each successful interaction reinforced his distorted sense of power, gradually lowering his psychological resistance to crossing boundaries that would lead him back toward violence. Jeffrey's internal conflict still surfaced occasionally, creating moments of hesitation that reflected remnants of his moral awareness. However, these moments became increasingly rare as his fantasies intensified and his dependence on alcohol weakened his emotional restraint. His apartment environment further encouraged this transformation by providing a secluded space where he could control every aspect of social interaction. The absence of external accountability allowed him to rationalize dangerous behavior as necessary to prevent the overwhelming loneliness that he feared more than anything else. During this period, Jeffrey's encounters began revealing early warning signs of the violent pattern that would soon emerge. His attempts to maintain control during these interactions reflected his growing inability to separate fantasy from reality. Each encounter deepened his psychological detachment, gradually transforming his perception of relationships into something transactional and manipulative.
The emotional desperation that had once driven his actions evolved into a colder, more calculated mindset that viewed companionship as something to be controlled rather than shared. Although these encounters did not immediately result in violence, they created a foundation that allowed Jeffrey's dangerous impulses to grow stronger with each passing night. His confidence in his ability to manipulate situations increased, reinforcing the belief that he could continue pushing boundaries without being discovered.
The apartment that symbolized independence had now become the center of his psychological descent, a place where fantasies were slowly transforming into real-world actions that would soon escalate into tragedy. Lies in the chilling realization that Jeffrey's growing confidence and emotional detachment would soon lead him toward a moment when hesitation would disappear entirely, allowing his fantasies to evolve into repeated acts of violence that would begin forming the horrifying pattern that would eventually shock the nation and place him among the most infamous criminals in American history. By the late 1980s, Jeffrey's life had settled into a disturbing rhythm that balanced outward normalcy with an increasingly dangerous internal reality. His job continued providing financial stability, allowing him to maintain an apartment that offered the complete privacy he had grown dependent on. Co-workers and casual acquaintances saw him as reserved but functional, a quiet man who kept to himself and avoided unnecessary attention. Beneath this carefully maintained exterior, however, his psychological boundaries had weakened to a point where fantasy and reality began merging in ways that felt increasingly irreversible. Jeffrey's encounters with strangers had become more deliberate and calculated, driven by a growing confidence that he could maintain control over situations without facing consequences. His experiences had slowly erased the hesitation that once existed during his earlier attempts to form connections. The emotional desperation that once created conflict within him had transformed into a cold determination shaped by obsession. He began viewing relationships not as shared emotional experiences, but as opportunities to create the companionship he believed he deserved, regardless of consent or consequence. The privacy of his apartment played a critical role in strengthening this transformation. It allowed him to experiment with behaviors that reflected his darkest impulses, reinforcing his belief that isolation protected him from accountability. Each interaction became a test of control, gradually pushing him further into psychological territory that removed empathy from his decision-making process. The absence of meaningful relationships or emotional intervention allowed these behaviors to escalate without resistance, turning his private living space into an environment where disturbing fantasies could evolve into calculated actions. During this period, Jeffrey's substance abuse intensified, weakening the fragile restraints that still remained within his conscience. Alcohol continued blurring the boundaries between thought and action, amplifying his intrusive fantasies and lowering his emotional awareness of consequences. His nights became increasingly focused on seeking strangers, carefully choosing individuals he believed he could manipulate. These decisions reflected a chilling level of planning that revealed how far he had drifted from the frightened teenager who once panicked after his first violent act. As Jeffrey's psychological detachment deepened, the internal line that separated imagination from reality finally disappeared. His encounters became more aggressive in intention, revealing a man who had gradually lost the ability to distinguish companionship from possession. Each successful manipulation reinforced his belief that he could control outcomes indefinitely.
His apartment, once a symbol of independence, now functioned as a carefully managed environment where he felt absolute authority over every interaction that occurred within its walls. The transformation unfolding within Jeffrey represented the final stage of a long psychological descent that had begun years earlier with loneliness, trauma, and emotional instability. What once appeared as isolated, disturbing thoughts had evolved into a consistent behavioral pattern shaped by obsession and control. His confidence in maintaining secrecy grew stronger with each encounter, creating a dangerous illusion of invincibility that pushed him toward repeating actions without hesitation. Lies in the terrifying reality that Jeffrey's growing confidence and calculated behavior would soon lead to a series of disappearances that would attract attention beyond his control. As law enforcement and concerned families began noticing patterns that pointed toward a hidden predator, the carefully constructed secrecy surrounding his life would begin cracking, setting the stage for a confrontation between his darkest world and a society that was about to uncover the horrifying truth. As the pattern of Jeffrey's behavior intensified, the consequences of his actions slowly began spreading beyond the walls of his apartment. The late 1980s and early 1990s brought a growing number of missing persons reports across Milwaukee, each case representing families searching for answers that seemed increasingly difficult to find. At first, these disappearances appeared isolated, scattered across different neighborhoods and social circles.
Law enforcement agencies treated them as separate investigations, unaware that a single individual was quietly responsible for a series of vanishings that would later horrify the nation. Jeffrey, meanwhile, had grown disturbingly confident in his ability to avoid suspicion. His routine remained carefully structured to maintain an appearance of normality. He continued working regular shifts, interacting politely with coworkers, and maintaining a lifestyle that appeared uneventful to anyone observing from the outside. This dual existence allowed him to hide his darkest activities behind a mask of quiet predictability. His ability to separate his public persona from his private actions reinforced the dangerous belief that he could continue operating without detection. However, small warning signs began emerging within his apartment building and surrounding neighborhood. Residents occasionally noticed unusual odors drifting through hallways, prompting complaints that were often dismissed as plumbing or maintenance issues. Jeffrey responded to these concerns with calm explanations, maintaining the illusion that nothing unusual existed within his apartment. His composed demeanor prevented immediate suspicion, allowing him to continue living within a community that remained unaware of the horrifying reality hidden behind one closed door. At the same time, families of missing individuals intensified their search efforts, sharing stories with local authorities and community members in hopes of uncovering any clues. Their determination slowly began connecting pieces of a puzzle that law enforcement had not yet fully assembled. Several disappearances involved individuals who had last been seen in nightlife areas that Jeffrey frequented. Although these connections initially appeared coincidental, they planted seeds of concern that would later become critical in exposing his crimes. Jeffrey's confidence in his secrecy reached its peak during this period, encouraging him to continue his dangerous behavior with increasing boldness.
His psychological detachment had grown so strong that he believed his careful planning would permanently shield him from consequences. He became more comfortable inviting strangers into his apartment, convinced that his isolation provided absolute control over every situation. This misplaced confidence pushed him toward decisions that would ultimately lead to his downfall, as his actions became riskier and more difficult to conceal.
Meanwhile, community anxiety slowly increased as missing persons cases accumulated without resolution. Law enforcement agencies began recognizing troubling patterns, though they had not yet identified the full scope of the danger. Investigators quietly gathered information, unaware that they were moving closer to uncovering one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. Jeffrey remained oblivious to the fact that his carefully constructed world was beginning to fracture under the weight of growing suspicion. Lies in the chilling moment when one unexpected encounter would shatter Jeffrey's illusion of control. A single survivor would manage to escape his apartment, leading police directly into the hidden nightmare he had spent years concealing, triggering a discovery so horrifying that it would permanently shock the nation and expose the terrifying truth behind the disappearances that had haunted Milwaukee. And control was beginning to crack under the weight of his escalating behavior. His confidence had grown dangerously strong, allowing him to believe that years of avoiding suspicion had made him untouchable. Inside his apartment, he continued living within a routine that revolved around isolation, calculated encounters, and the disturbing belief that he could manipulate every situation without facing consequences. However, on one humid July evening, fate introduced a moment that would destroy the illusion he had spent years creating.
Jeffrey visited a local bar where he quietly observed potential companions, maintaining the calm and approachable demeanor that had allowed him to gain trust in the past. That night, he encountered a man named Tracy Edwards, who agreed to accompany him back to his apartment after what appeared to be a casual social interaction. Jeffrey presented the invitation as harmless, offering money in exchange for spending time together and listening to music. The proposal seemed unusual but not immediately threatening, allowing Tracy to accept without realizing the horrifying situation he was stepping into. Once inside the apartment, the atmosphere began shifting in subtle yet unsettling ways. Jeffrey's behavior became increasingly tense and unpredictable, creating a growing sense of discomfort that Tracy could not fully explain. The apartment carried an overwhelming presence that felt deeply unsettling, though Tracy initially struggled to identify the source of his fear. As time passed, Jeffrey's attempts to maintain control over the interaction became more aggressive, revealing a psychological instability that he could no longer hide beneath polite conversation. Tracy's instinct slowly alerted him that something was dangerously wrong. Jeffrey's demeanor shifted between calm conversation and unsettling fixation, creating an environment filled with unpredictable tension. As the situation escalated, Tracy realized he needed to escape, yet doing so required careful navigation of a space where Jeffrey maintained physical and psychological control.
The fear of triggering violence forced Tracy to remain outwardly cooperative while quietly searching for an opportunity to leave the apartment safely. After a tense period of psychological maneuvering, Tracy managed to create a moment of distraction that allowed him to break free from Jeffrey's control. He fled the apartment and rushed into the night, his fear transforming into urgent determination as he searched for help. His escape marked the first time someone had successfully left Jeffrey's apartment with knowledge of the horrifying reality hidden inside. Tracy quickly contacted police officers, desperately explaining the terrifying experience and urging them to investigate the apartment immediately. When law enforcement entered the apartment, they were unprepared for the disturbing evidence they would soon uncover. The discovery revealed a scene that shocked investigators and forced them to confront one of the most horrifying criminal cases in American history. The apartment, once Jeffrey's private sanctuary, became a crime scene that exposed years of hidden violence and psychological darkness.
The evidence found inside not only confirmed Tracy's story, but also revealed the true scale of Jeffrey's crimes, triggering a national investigation that would soon dominate headlines across the country. Lies in the chilling aftermath of this discovery, as Jeffrey would face interrogation, public exposure, and a confession that would reveal disturbing details about his crimes, leading to a courtroom battle that would force America to confront the terrifying psychological reality behind one of its most infamous serial killers, while delivering the final chapter of this dark and haunting story. The arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer triggered an immediate wave of national attention as investigators and journalists rushed to understand the full extent of the crimes uncovered inside his apartment. Law enforcement officials quickly realized they were dealing with a case that extended far beyond a single violent incident. Evidence collected from the apartment revealed a chilling pattern that connected Jeffrey to multiple disappearances that had troubled the Milwaukee community for years. As investigators pieced together the horrifying details, the nation watched with growing disbelief, struggling to comprehend how such crimes could remain hidden in an ordinary residential building. Jeffrey's interrogation became one of the most disturbing phases of the investigation. Detectives expected resistance, denial, or attempts to minimize responsibility, yet Jeffrey responded with an unsettling level of calmness and cooperation. He spoke with an eerie composure, describing his actions with a detached clarity that shocked even experienced investigators. His confession unfolded gradually, revealing details about his psychological motivations, his fear of abandonment, and the obsessive need for control that had shaped his behavior for more than a decade. Each statement exposed another layer of darkness, forcing detectives to confront the terrifying complexity of his mind.
As news of his confession spread across the country, public reaction shifted between horror, anger, and disbelief. Families of missing individuals followed the investigation closely, hoping for answers while preparing themselves for devastating confirmation. For many families, Jeffrey's confession provided closure, yet it also reopened emotional wounds that could never fully heal. The courtroom would soon become a stage where grief, anger, and justice collided as victim families prepared to confront the man responsible for unimaginable loss. The trial attracted national media attention, transforming the courtroom into a symbol of public fascination and moral outrage. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence detailing the pattern of disappearances, while psychological experts analyzed Jeffrey's mental state, attempting to explain the disturbing motivations behind his crimes. Defense attorneys explored arguments related to mental illness, questioning whether Jeffrey fully understood the consequences of his actions. The legal battle quickly evolved into a national conversation about criminal psychology, responsibility, and the limits of human empathy. Throughout the proceedings, Jeffrey maintained the same unsettling composure that had defined his interrogation. His behavior reinforced the disturbing reality that his emotional detachment extended even into the courtroom, leaving many observers shocked by his calm demeanor. When he eventually delivered a statement acknowledging his crimes, the room filled with a heavy silence that reflected the emotional weight carried by every family present. His confession confirmed the horrifying scale of his actions, closing the investigative chapter while opening a deeper societal conversation about how such crimes could develop unnoticed. As the trial concluded and justice was formally delivered, the case left behind a permanent scar on American criminal history.
The nation had confronted the terrifying truth about a man who had hidden monstrous behavior behind an ordinary life. Yet, while the courtroom delivered legal closure, It could not erase the psychological questions that continued haunting investigators, families, and society as a whole. The strong re-hook for the final part lies in the haunting chapter that followed Jeffrey's conviction, as his life inside prison would reveal unexpected changes, growing public hatred, and a violent ending that would once again shock the nation, bringing a chilling conclusion to a story that began with loneliness and ended with a legacy of darkness that continues to disturb the world today. Following his conviction, Jeffrey was transferred to the high-security facility at Columbia Correctional Institution, where he would spend the remainder of his life under constant supervision. The prison represented a world completely different from the apartment where his crimes had unfolded, yet it introduced a new form of isolation that carried its own psychological consequences. Surrounded by concrete walls, armed guards, and inmates who were fully aware of his notoriety, Jeffrey entered an environment filled with tension, hostility, and unpredictable danger. Prison life forced him into routines that were rigidly structured, yet the emotional and psychological atmosphere surrounding him was far more volatile than anything he had experienced before. Many inmates viewed him with extreme hatred, considering his crimes unforgivable and disturbing even within the violent culture of incarceration. His presence created constant security concerns, leading prison authorities to carefully monitor his interactions with other inmates. Despite these precautions, Jeffrey appeared strangely calm, maintaining the same detached demeanor that had unsettled investigators and courtroom observers during his trial. During his time in prison, Jeffrey reportedly underwent a significant personal transformation that surprised both prison staff and the public. He began attending religious services and participating in conversations about faith and redemption. Some observers interpreted this change as an attempt to seek forgiveness or emotional closure, while others believed it reflected his continued struggle to understand his own psychological darkness. His behavior inside prison created controversy, with critics questioning whether genuine remorse was possible for crimes of such magnitude, while supporters of rehabilitation argued that personal transformation should remain possible even for the most notorious offenders. Despite these attempts at personal change, Jeffrey's presence inside the prison remained highly dangerous. He lived under constant threat from inmates who viewed him as a symbol of extreme criminal depravity.
The tension surrounding him created an environment where violence could erupt without warning, reflecting the harsh reality of prison culture, where notoriety often attracted deadly consequences. Correctional officers remained vigilant, yet the hostility directed toward him continued growing as his story spread throughout the prison population. On a cold morning in November 1994, that growing tension reached its breaking point. During a routine work assignment inside the facility, Jeffrey was attacked by another inmate in an act of sudden and brutal violence. The incident unfolded quickly, leaving prison staff struggling to intervene before the fatal damage had already occurred. His death marked a shocking and violent conclusion to a life that had been defined by psychological darkness, secrecy, and unimaginable crimes. News of his killing spread rapidly across the nation, reigniting public fascination while also bringing a grim sense of finality to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. Jeffrey's story left behind a legacy filled with complex questions about mental health, criminal psychology, societal responsibility, and the hidden dangers that can exist behind ordinary appearances. His crimes forced law enforcement agencies to reevaluate investigative procedures and encouraged communities to recognize warning signs that might otherwise be ignored. The story serves as a haunting reminder that darkness can develop quietly, often hidden beneath the surface of everyday life, waiting for circumstances that allow it to emerge with devastating consequences.
Before closing this dark and chilling journey, if you were captivated by this deep psychological crime story and want to explore more hidden histories, disturbing mysteries, and true crime narratives, make sure to subscribe to Canon of Darkness and stay connected with stories that reveal the shadows history often tries to forget. The echo that remains with this story is not about what happened inside prison walls, but about the unsettling question that continues haunting investigators and society today, which is how many similar warning signs exist around us that remain unnoticed, quietly waiting in the background, reminding us that the line between ordinary life and unimaginable darkness can sometimes be far thinner than we ever expect.